Zimbabwe's nurses strike out and head back to work as the government plays hardball, as the president sent the message that dissent won't be tolerated. I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is Zimbabwe's health sector strikes. All they wanted was a fairer salary and better working conditions. Instead, they were fired on national television. Thousands of nurses were let go by Zimbabwe's vice president after they staged a walkout which paralyzed major hospitals. Many expected President Mnangagwa to reprimand his deputy, but instead he backed him up and supported the sackings. Now the nurses have called off their strike and returned to work for the same conditions as before. So, has the president let down those Zimbabweans who had hope for change? Here's Shoaib Hassan.
It appears to be the end of a standoff in Zimbabwe as nurses return to work. They had been on strike for a week across the country, demanding better pay and working conditions.
I'm not able to give my kids what they deserve to get. Even the school that I'm sending my children is not the school that they are supposed to go to. As a nurse, I expect to send my child to an A school, but they just go to a B school because I cannot afford with my salary. I have to do something else so that I get more income for my children.
The strike took place within days of a similar one staged by the National Association of Doctors. Together, they are the biggest mass protests under the government of recently elected President Emmerson Mnangagwa. Vice President Constantino Chiwengo's ordered the sacking of the striking nurses during a television interview on Wednesday, a decision backed by the president. Mnangagwa has assumed power after Zimbabwe's longest ruling leader Robert Mugabe resigned, following a military takeover last year. The new leader's campaign promises included fixing the economy and addressing the grievances of the public sector. That appears to have changed with his support for the sacking of the striking nurses. It seems to have worked, although the nurses say they have returned only after the government rolled back the dismissals. But their demands have not been met, and that seems to hold ominous portents for the continuing doctors' strike. Will it result in another showdown with the government? And will that push the new president to resort to the hardline tactics of the former regime? Shoaib Hassan, the newsmakers.
To discuss this, I'm joined from Harare by Doug Coltart. He's a human rights lawyer and activist. And we also have Nigel Mugamu. He's a journalist and founder of the online news publication 263 Chat. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. Nigel, if I could begin with you, why is it that the nurses seem to have blinked first? Why have they gone back to work and haven't got anything in return?
Look, I think basically government put its foot down and said, look, you lost you've lost your job basically. And obviously the context to this is a day before the Independence Day on the 17th of April. This is when they were fired, and of course, or they went to they went on strike, and then of course they were then fired Independence Day. So they've obviously been reinstated, but obviously conversations have obviously taken place, and government is not in a position to do anything about the situation right now, given that the elections are in a few months from now.
Okay, so Doug, do you agree that the government is not in a position to do anything right now?
If I may just clarify, in a position to do what? I think
hold on. So Nigel, explain that. I took it as, when you said the government's not in a position to do anything, you mean that the government doesn't quite maybe have the money as well in order to up their salaries and so on. Is that what you meant? Okay.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Okay, so Doug.
Government doesn't have the salaries.
Okay, so Doug, government can't really do anything right now. Do you agree with that?
I don't agree. I think that really it comes down to misplaced priorities by the government that spends a lot on other things, and we see that lavish spending in the media all the time. and a lack of priority of the nurses. But I think to some extent, the real issue here is was the summary dismissal of thousands of nurses by the vice president, who is not their employer, and who has no legal basis to conduct a firing in such a fashion. So I think that was the major reason. That was kind of the driving force behind the outrage, I think, from the general public at what happened. That thousands of workers could be fired by the vice president.
Okay, so Nigel, even if the government had a point and the money is not in the coffers, was that public humiliation of the firing of thousands of nurses done on TV the wrong move by the vice president? And for the president to then endorse that, was that even worse?
Look, yes, I think education and health are very, very important to us. So either directly or indirectly. But I certainly don't want to go to the hospital when I'm sick and for a nurse or someone in the medical profession to help me to get better if they're disgruntled. I mean, that's a problem for me, and so the issues around why are they disgruntled need to be fundamentally addressed. I've also said that, look, a lot of the issues that they are dealing with are around their working conditions. I'm not entirely sure what the working conditions are in detail, but I'm sure some of those can be sorted out without incurring any cost.
Right.
So if it means changing shifts or whatever the issues are, I'm sure there's things that can actually be done. But to me, it's less about the embarrassment of people being fired all at the same time, and it's more about why are they being fired. And as a citizen, that concerned me a great deal. How can you just fire a whole profession all at one go? And I think the timing wasn't great. The day before Independence Day on TV.
Right.
I mean, I think there's another way of handling this kind of situation.
Right. So, Doug, looking at or listening to what some of the nurses were saying, they're saying pay disparities. They're saying we don't get paid enough. They're saying we don't have enough medicines in the hospital. The conditions are not good. The hospitals don't have the right facilities. And the list goes on and on. Given that the vice president did this, responded in such a way that President Mnangagwa supported him and that the government put their foot down, as Nigel says, is there any indication that the government is going to take any of these grievances, these deeper-rooted grievances, seriously?
Unfortunately, it seems not, and it's important to realize that these are grievances that date back to 2010. These are allowances and full salaries that nurses have not been paid for nearly 10 years. And in addition to that, some of the basic things that they're asking for is a rationalization of the pay structure. Some senior nurses with masters, even PhDs, get paid less than drivers, or just general hands in the hospital due to just a pure sort of administrative mistake. Which could very, very easily be rectified.
Okay.
But the strong arm way that government has handled this doesn't seem to demonstrate that they are going to be willing to address those grievances.
Okay, right. Themba Mliswa joins us now. He's an independent member of Zimbabwe's parliament and a former member of the ruling ZANU-PF party. Themba, we have this situation. It's played out in the way it played out. The nurses are back at work, but would you agree that this has been an embarrassing situation for Zimbabwe?
Listen, I think what is important for us is to understand that the nurses play a very integral part in nation building from a health point of view, the same way the teachers do, the same way the civil servants do. So it would certainly not be a welcome development to see them striking. And I think intervention is needed from the highest office in the country. And I think this is why the Vice President Chiwenga was involved, because it then seeks that attention. And for me, they've worked hard for the country. They've been patriotic, they've been nationalist. And I speak from a background that my mother is a nurse of over 40 years. So I am aware of what nurses go through. and what they do. You cannot ask for a better serving people than civil servants in this country, nurses in particular. And it's only good and fair that they are remunerated fairly.
But they're not being remunerated fairly. As an MP, how do you feel about that?
It's an issue which the Minister of Finance needs to deal with. I think it's pretty clear that a lot of money is lost through corrupt activities in government, and the Auditor General, Mrs. Chari, is very clear in her reports, and that there's money which is not accounted for in government. And as such, the fiscus has lost a lot of money through parastatals which have not been functioning for a long time, at the expense of good people who work, who should be paid well. So that's something that you cannot really say is being done fairly, because they deserve to be remunerated. There's a shortage of nurses already in the country before this happens. So they're working overtime. And if somebody's working overtime, pay them for the overtime and for the work that they're putting in. There's no debate there. I think it's as clear as that. And I think government must also be putting together measures in which they ensure that the health sector, which is critical in the country, is well manned, the same way they did with the security sector. You know that we are dealing with inquiry on diamonds. The security sector was given diamonds because of the fact that they are very key in the peace of the country. So should the nurses also be given something for their key in the health sector of the country?
Right. Nigel, there is money, it's just not being properly allocated. You're hearing that from an MP?
Yes, I mean, I agree with it. I agree that, our priorities, and I agree with even what David said, our priorities aren't right. I think, looking ahead, right now we are in the middle of school holidays. Children go back to school. My daughter goes back to school in about 2 weeks. I spoke to a teacher who also said, look, if they don't solve the nurses issue, we are prepared to go on strike as teachers, because there's also been an issue there in that sector. So, look, we're living in interesting times, but and I think the priorities need to be, we need to prioritize. Like I said, education and health are very key sectors in our country, as with any country in the world.
Right. Temba, was the vice president extra confident, and maybe did he gamble a little bit, given that he knew that there were so many unemployed nurses and so many who had taken early retirement, who would have wanted to come back for, I don't know, a little bit of extra pay, and that's why he could play hardball?
No, listen, to me, it's not about having a lot of unemployed nurses. The issue is to remunerate those nurses who are currently working. Already they're working overtime. And what was important for the vice president to understand is that most of these are legacy issues which were done by the former president, Mugabe. And it was important for him in the new dispensation to say, yes, point taken, the nurses are correct in advocating for the remuneration in this manner. But can they give us time so that we look at it and we respond to the matter quickly? There's an issue of admission. You cannot talk about a new dispensation when you're not able to also talk about the old regime or the old dispensation, which did not do things properly. So the two work together in terms of achieving a futuristic approach for the country. And I think this is what we must be used to, in admitting that, yes, things were not done properly, but now they're going to be done properly. Please, we ask you to continue working, but we will be attending to it so that there is clear indication that there's the new dispensation. Not to behave as if we're in the old dispensation is unacceptable. And I think it is important we take cognizance of the fact that the nurses for a long time have suffered, and they cannot keep on suffering. And the new dispensation must not be new in terms of administration, but it must be new in terms of doing things which point out that surely there's a new dispensation. His Excellency the President surely has gone around the world and has indicated to the world how Zimbabwe is open for business. And that does not only talk about people coming into Zimbabwe. We must first of all do good for our people. Charity begins at home.
So, Doug Coulthard, given that it's been mentioned that it was a legacy issue from the old dispensation, and I think you can all agree that this is a legacy issue from the Mugabe era, do you think that Emmerson Mnangagwa has failed the test to prove that the new dispensation is different?
I would have to say that he has. I think that this is what a lot of citizens feared when a large number of military personnel were incorporated into government, that we would see a militarization of our governance practices, and that really seems to be what happened over the last week. That it almost felt like our labor practices were being run like a military barracks, and Chiwenga's decision, Vice President's decision to fire the nurses, the chaos that has been wreaked as a result of that is not entirely done away with government now allowing some of the nurses to come back. I was speaking with nurses this morning. Those who have been allowed to come back are concerned that some have decades of experience. Will those decades of experience still count? Some of the nurses who tried to go back have been denied and told that they will not be accepted back into their jobs. Yeah. So while certainly we're glad that some nurses are being allowed back and that our hospitals are functional again, the confusion and the chaos from such an irrational and undemocratic decision, are still being felt.
Yeah, no, they have to reapply for their jobs. We're hearing, as you say, that a lot of them have been let in, some of them have not, and they're awaiting readmission into their old jobs on the same terms that they had beforehand. Nigel, I've got a little stat that came last year from the Health Minister, Dr. David Parirenyatwa, who he gave this last year, and it jumped out at me. It said the current nurse staffing complement, about 16,000, was equal to levels in 1980 at independence. And back then the population was, I guess, half of what it is now. What does that tell you, Nigel?
Look, it's a worrying statistic. I'm a numbers guy, so numbers stats are very key for me. But it's a very worrying statistic. As I mentioned, the health sector is very, very crucial in any society. More so here in Zimbabwe. What I worry about while we discuss this is we could be discussing stats and and various other issues, but let's also think about the patients, because last week on Wednesday, a patient was lying on a hospital bed and they weren't being attended to by a nurse. I mean, I wonder where that patient is today. So yeah, those statistics are worrying. We need to invest more in the health sector in this country. I believe the Abuja Declaration speaks about 15% of the national budget needs to go towards the health sector. Here in Zimbabwe, the health sector is heavily subsidized by a lot of donors, and that is not a sustainable situation. We need to increase our own investment as a country in the health sector, and I'm eager to see what happens with the budget this year, after the elections.
So as we broaden this out, Themba, besides looking after nurses and ensuring they are motivated to do what they do, such an important job, how would you fix the entire health sector, Themba?
First of all, there's a Abuja Declaration which must be adhered to. I think it's important to know that as Parliament, we certainly recommended that. There was no way we're going to pass the budget without the Abuja Agreement being factored in. It was a very important issue, and parliamentarians were in unison pertaining to this issue. So Parliament did its job ensuring that we're not passing and we're not voting until this is passed. So we're very clear on that, realizing how important the health sector is. And I think what is important too is to realize that from a legislative point of view, we also have a situation where I think the Minister of Health is widely funded by donors, and I think it's a situation which is not sustainable. And I think pay as you earn, which was government biggest revenue, is no longer that because of the unemployment levels which are there. So as a result, the nurses are likely to suffer. But we would also like the nurses to be treated the same way the military, the police, and others are treated in terms of being given timeously their bonuses and their salaries on time. There is an issue of bonuses which also eats into all this, because this is a culmination of so many problems which have not been dealt with. And this is what happens. As much as I also feel for the patients and for people dying, my appeal to the nurses too is that you've been very nationalistic about this. You've been very patriotic, and you've paid a heavy price. But there's also human life which is there. Should we allow it to go? Because of that, everybody has a conscience at the end of the day. I would want their conscience to be their master. At the same time, government must not allow a situation like this to prevail. That is the reason why there are elections. And now it goes back to the people to decide who they should elect so that they can be a competent Minister of Health and a government which is able to solve problems. The president can only do so much. He has a team around him. And if the team is not working according to expectations of the people from a health point of view, I mean, there's not even enough clinics, hospitals. Government has spoken about building 2,000 clinics. I asked the Minister of Health the other day in Parliament, question time, what government had done to achieve that in terms of the policy and manifesto that they had. And no clinics have been built. He could not give a figure. He says, I'll come the figure. So to me, if you're not then even building more clinics, which are critical, because it should be in the radius of 7 kilometers for want of access to a clinic. And it's no longer that, it's 20, 30. So that's not even in line with government policy. So there are a lot of outstanding issues from a health point of view, which really, at the end of the day, they're not attended to. This is what happens at the end of the day. And I think it does not put us in good light as leaders, as a country, and even the nurses themselves again.
Right.
But they're human. They need to eat, they need to pay bills.
Okay. Well, there's a massive wish list for Zimbabweans and a massive list of challenges for this new government. Gentlemen, it's been fascinating talking to all of you. Doug Coltart, Nigel Mugamu and Themba Mliswa. Thanks so much for joining us here on The Newsmakers. Still ahead on The Newsmakers, a multi-billion-dollar pipeline fuels tension in Canada. Is Trudeau abandoning the environment for the economy? And South African President Cyril Ramaphosa faces one of his biggest tests as protesters demand an end to corruption. He may be one of the world's more popular politicians, but Justin Trudeau is about to make some enemies. A multi-billion-dollar pipeline expansion he approved last year is at the center of a major feud within Canada's borders. Neighbouring provinces, British Columbia and Alberta, both have a very different take on the project. Alberta says it's essential for the country's economy, but British Columbia says it will devastate the environment. Right now, it seems Trudeau, a leader praised for his green credentials, is backing big business. He's vowed the pipeline will go ahead. So is the charismatic Canadian allowing economic interests to trump environmental concerns? Christine Pirovalakis reports.
Canadians fighting for the environment are done with playing nice. Opponents of plans to expand an oil pipeline across the country are taking on the government and Kinder Morgan, the company behind the project. With a price tag of $5 billion, the Trans Mountain Expansion Project was approved by the Canadian federal government in 2016. It will expand an existing pipeline and lay nearly 1,000 kilometers of new pipe between what's known as the tar sands in the province of Alberta to the Pacific coast of British Columbia. The pipeline's capacity will nearly triple to 890,000 barrels of oil a day. And the project will also expand the marine terminal in Burnaby, British Columbia, allowing the number of tankers it can receive every month to increase from 5 to 34.
Tar sands oil is amongst the dirtiest fossil fuels on the planet. It's dirtier than coal. And Prime Minister Trudeau is here in London to talk about climate responsibility. And our message to Mr. Trudeau is that climate leaders don't build pipelines.
For months, the provinces of Alberta and British Columbia have been fighting over the issue. Alberta is hoping the expansion will allow it to get its oil to markets in Asia and reduce its reliance on the U.S. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who gave the go-ahead for the pipeline expansion, says it will boost Canada's economy and create new jobs. But opponents don't believe him. Environmentalists and the provincial government in British Columbia say the project threatens the region's wildlife, including an endangered group of killer whales, and could cause even more oil spills. Opposition has also come from some First Nations people. They say the project violates their land rights and threatens water supplies. Since being elected, Trudeau has promised reconciliation with Canada's Indigenous people, but the pipeline is putting that pledge to the test. For all his promises of tackling climate change, Trudeau says he will push ahead with the pipeline expansion, even if he has to change legislation and use public money to fund it. British Columbia, on the other hand, says it will do everything it can to stop it, pledging to go to the province's high court soon. The battle between the two provinces over Trans Mountain has now turned into a trade war. Alberta has passed legislation that could hit the British Columbia economy by restricting the flow of oil and gas into the province. The feud has reached a boiling point, with Kinder Morgan now putting the pipeline expansion on hold. And it's threatened to pull out of the project altogether unless all sides resolve their differences by the end of May. The pipeline battle has pitted many groups against each other, leaving many to argue whether it will mean more prosperity or spills. Christine Pirovolakis, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined from Toronto by Chris Alexander. He was Canada's Minister of Citizenship and Immigration under Trudeau's Conservative predecessor, Stephen Harper. Also in Toronto is Keith Stewart. He's a senior energy strategist for Greenpeace Canada. And in Vancouver, we have Chief Bob Chamberlain. He's the Vice President of the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. There's so many players in this. I'm looking at who's involved here. You have the British Columbia government. You have the Alberta government, you have the federal government, there's the oil pipeline itself and Kinder Morgan, the company from Texas. You have those who want it, mainly in Alberta, those who do not want it, which includes Indigenous Canadians or First Nations, Vancouver residents, and so on and so forth. So this is fascinating. So many moving parts, so many people involved here. Let me start with you, Keith Stewart. Tell me why you do not want this pipeline to be built.
Well, the oil and gas sector is the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada. It's the fastest rising source, and it's, if we continue to build new pipelines which allow the expansion of the tar sands, which is, again, major source of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada, then we won't be able to achieve our climate commitments under the Paris Agreement. This pipeline would increase emissions by sort of 13 to 15 million tons per year, according to Environment Canada. That's about the same as the reductions we anticipate from the national carbon tax that Trudeau is bringing in. So it's kind of one step forward, one step back. We also think it's really important for Canada's sort of national effort for reconciliation with Indigenous people that we respect the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples, and this pipeline simply doesn't have it. So for climate reasons, for human rights reasons, Indigenous reconciliation, it's just the wrong way to go. We need to be investing in a green economy that's going to bring those types of jobs to Canada, not trying to keep the oil industry on life support.
Chris Alexander, that's quite a strong argument from Keith Stewart, isn't it?
Well, I agree absolutely that we need to keep embracing a green economy, green industries, including green energy. But the solution isn't to shut down one of Canada's most vibrant, most successful, most globally competitive industries. We have the third largest oil reserves in the world after Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. Saudi Arabia produces twice as much as we do, Venezuela less, but it's a dictatorship with very little investment. We're the only major oil producer that cannot get its product to global markets. We do not have today a major oil pipeline either to the Pacific or the Atlantic coast. We are prisoners beholden to the US economy on this. We sell our oil to them at a discount. That disadvantages Canada. It disadvantages our ability to protect our environment. It disadvantages the world because Canadian oil is recovered, is produced in a more environmentally sound way than anywhere else in the world. It's ironic that because we're not able to supply our own needs, our imports from Nigeria, Algeria, Venezuela have increased in recent years, and I don't think they're doing anything for the environment. It would be far better if we could get our oil, our responsibly produced oil, to market at world market prices.
Okay, so Chief Bob Chamberlain, I wanted to bring you in third, and I'll tell you why. no disrespect to Keith Stewart, but Keith, we knew what you were going to say. I mean, you're Greenpeace, right? So I sort of figured out what you were going to say. You were going to be anti this. But Chief Bob Chamberlain, after you heard what Chris Alexander had to say about the economic argument and talking about clean, green energy, are you swayed by any of that as a First Nations leader?
The challenge that First Nations people face in Canada is something that has been going on for generations. And this is First Nations people being prisoners of democracy. For far too long, the Canadian governments have put the needs of everybody else ahead of that of the human rights of First Nations people here in Canada. And I want the international community to know that as a result of the Canadian government embracing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, this is an appropriate step for Canada to advance beyond its colonial past of oppression of First Nations people. And now with the tension point today, of course, is the Kinder Morgan pipeline. But unless the Canadian governments, both federally and provincially, change how they do their business and create the appropriate space and place for First Nations governance to be able to provide consent or non-consent, that this is going to play out again and again and again. And this is as a result of the evolution of Canadian law in relationship to First Nations people. And so the challenge is for the government to get consent along a very broad path of a pipeline.
Right. And Chief, given that the federal government so far does support this pipeline, if Trudeau goes ahead with this, do you believe that it would unravel some of the good work done on Indigenous reconciliation?
It is certainly going to cause a lot of damage in terms of the credibility of the government and its statements to the international world of embracing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Of course, First Nations have wanted consent in their traditional territories all the way through the history of Canada, but the governments have ignored their own case law from the Supreme Court of Canada and the Constitution of this country in order to continue on with the pursuit of economy over top of the human rights of Aboriginal people in Canada.
Okay, so Chris Alexander, is it a case of economy versus human rights and environment?
Well, listen, the Chief has an extremely good point here. There is a legacy of abuse. We're still dealing with the residential schools legacy, which is tragic for all of Canada and for First Nations in particular. We are still dealing with British Columbia, one of our largest provinces, where most territory is still unceded, where most First Nations no longer have treaties with the Crown in Canada, and that is long overdue for resolution. My view, and I think the view of many, probably the majority of Canadians, and indeed of First Nations, is that we should use the opportunity of this pipeline expansion to build that consent, to strengthen that dialogue, to improve that conversation. We're not going to get a better chance. This is an existing pipeline. It's been there for over 70 years, only 300,000 barrels a day of capacity. The project is to take it to 900,000 barrels along the same route,
right? But I mean,
more or less.
But when you're saying it's an existing pipeline, sorry to interrupt
route.
you. I mean, they're building a new one alongside it to boost capacity, right? So this is $6 billion US. It's an expansion project.
Correct.
It's a new pipeline running alongside it. You can't say it's an existing pipeline, right?
Well, I'm saying there is an existing pipeline. This one will take the same route. So it's not breaking new ground. There is some consent for that route to date. Right. And there are First Nations, like the Simk First Nation around Kamloops, which has whose traditional territory accounts for 1/3 of the pipeline route, who are strongly in support, as are the Chipewyan First Nation around Edmonton, where the oil sands themselves are largely located.
Keith, I'm not ignoring you. I'm going to come to you in a minute. I just want to get a response from Chief Bob Chamberlain. Chief, there is consent from other First Nations tribes, and that's Chris's point. There's no unanimity amongst the First Nations when it comes to the route of the pipeline because it's following an existing route.
The Canadian government has made commitments to all First Nations, not just the First Nations that are approving of this project. Of course, there are First Nations that are supportive of this. They've weighed the benefits against the impacts to their territory, and that needs to be respected without question. But at the same time, the First Nations that have clearly said no and have not provided the free, prior, and informed consent, that also must be respected, because ignoring the answer no is a perpetuation of Canada's long sordid history in the denial of Aboriginal people the proper authority in their territories. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, the challenge for the Canadian government is that this pipeline covers or goes through First Nations territory that are both in favor of it and also opposed to it. So that's the challenge. But the Canadian government must make appropriate steps so that First Nations all across this country are able to have their human rights recognized and the authorities and decision makings that they have in their territories to be respected.
Right. Keith, is there anything that they could say to you to make you reconsider? If they could say, we're going to have as few emissions as possible, we're going to mitigate all factors to ensure that there won't be any oil spills when it comes to all the tankers and so on and so forth. Can they make an argument to go ahead with it in a clean, green way at all?
We're basically saying when we build something new, when we're going to spend billions of dollars to build new energy infrastructure, we need to be building renewable energy, energy efficiency, not expanding fossil fuel production. We do have the third largest reserve of oil in the world in northern Alberta. It's also some of the highest carbon oil in the entire world. Taking that out, processing it is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in this country. Putting billions in to keep that going for another 50 years, because that's how long you have to do this to make this pipeline economic, doesn't make sense at this moment. When Canada signed on to the Paris Accord, we said we want to decarbonize our economy. We want to get to net zero emissions by mid-century. Spending billions to increase production of fossil fuels at this time doesn't make sense when we desperately need that money for building the alternatives. That's going to create jobs, that's going to provide the energy that we need, that the world needs, but without destabilizing the climate.
So, Chris Alexander, you can't be both. You can't be a leader on tackling climate change and also building mega pipelines. That's what Keith's saying. Isn't that true?
Yeah. Well, no, I think we can. I think indeed we must. If we were to shut down Canada's 5 million barrels per day of oil production, which is really what Greenpeace and others are advocating, that production would not disappear from the face of the earth. It would be taken up by others, by OPEC countries, by the United States, which is expanding production more than any other country in the world right now. And Canada would be importing for its needs on a far larger scale than we're doing. We also would see oil recovered in many of these countries in unclean, unsafe, environmentally unsound ways, much worse than any practice that we've ever seen in Canada. We should strive to be part of this industry. We should strive to be the cleanest, the best, the most environmentally responsible, and we know that we can do that. That's the way to stimulate the growth of our green energy sector, of our clean tech sector, which is already very strong. You don't rob Peter to pay Paul in achieving a safe, sustainable, environmentally sound life for us all on this planet.
Keith Stewart, if anybody's going to do it, we should be doing it, the responsible nations. What do you think?
Well, I mean, we know we're not going to shut down the oil industry tomorrow, but what we're saying is we have to stop expanding it. And this is an expansion project. So we can actually reduce oil use in Canada to reduce those imports that he's talking about, although we are one of the major net exporters in the world. But we have a responsibility.
But can I make the point?
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, just if this pipeline is not built to allow us to export to Asia, then that production is not going to stop. It's simply going to be exported to the United States, who may export to world markets themselves and reap the benefit of that, but who will definitely pay a discount for Canadian oil, as they've already done. I think that's a neo-colonialist approach that the U.S. is taking and that some in Canada are endorsing. We should not be prisoners to a single market. We should not be captive to one market. That's not the way markets work. That's the way colonies used to work, in a mercantile system from which we are trying to escape.
Chief Bob Chamberlain, you're shaking your head in disagreement. I'm going to get you to respond in a second. Keith Stewart first. Response from Keith and then Chief Bob.
We have to be investing in reducing oil consumption, and that means more efficient vehicles. It means better public transit.
Agreed.
I think the arguments about is the oil going to the US or to world markets is missing the point. If we actually sort of start reducing supply here, Greenpeace is working around the world to do this. Like a lot of Canadian politicians complain, why do you pick on us? Well, we're doing this all around the world. And what we're trying to do is say, we have to pick a path here. And if we're going to have a safe climate, that means rapidly reducing fossil fuel consumption, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, to have a better future for our kids. And every country is saying, okay, yes, everyone else should take action, but not us.
Okay, right. Chief Bob Chamberlain, I want to give you the final word. Come in.
Well, I'm not surprised to hear your other guests speak about colonial approaches. And of course, that is what is being perpetuated here in Canada. And now that the Canadian government has embraced the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, this cannot be accomplished or fulfilled in a meaningful way without having First Nations having a proper place in governance and decision-making within their territories. And it's time now for Canada to wake up and realize what's going on globally. And what we're talking about now is alternative energy sources. It's something that's a global occurrence. Canada has an opportunity to capitalize on that and all the employment that would come with it. And that could be something that would generate some resources for First Nations in various places around the country. But to ram through another pipeline, knowingly running over top of the human rights of Aboriginal people, I want to believe that Canadians and the world would find this unacceptable, that a government such as Canada would make a decision to run roughshod over the human rights of people. We have a very large immigrant base to this country, and many of them have escaped different places in the world where human rights impacts were occurring. And I call on them to stand up and support First Nations so that we have the authority to make decisions based upon our human rights.
Okay, well, gentlemen, we definitely have a deeper understanding of the issue after this conversation, and I'm really pleased that we have had it. Chris Alexander, Keith Stewart, and Chief Bob Chamberlain. I've got to move on, but I thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers.
I want to assure everyone that we are going to act speedily on this matter. We are not able to give the exact time frame now, but we are going to act as speedily as possible to address each of the issues that have been raised with us.
He hasn't been in the job long, but Cyril Ramaphosa has certainly been busy. The South African president was forced to cut short his trip at the Commonwealth Summit in London as violent protests erupted in the South African city of Mahikeng. Demonstrators clashed with police as they demanded jobs, housing, and an end to corruption. A lot of the frustration is directed at the Premier of the Northwest Province, Supra Mahumapelo. He took over in 2014. Residents are now demanding his immediate removal, accusing him of corruption. Ramaphosa has appealed for calm, but will the president be able to deliver on his promise of clean governance, or will the streets of South Africa erupt once again? Well, to discuss this further, I'm joined now from Johannesburg by journalist and ENCA correspondent Michael Apple, who's been covering the protests in the Northwest. Good to talk to you, Michael. Let me begin by asking you, what did the people who are protesting say to you? In general, at the heart of it all, what do they want?
It's about basic service delivery. That's the starting point. It's about roads, it's about schools, it's about hospitals and clinics actually having medicine. It's about streetlights working, it's about refuse being collected, and it's about corruption being tackled in a meaningful way. And of course, the latch that these protesters, rioters, looters even have used, the call sign has been on the platform of that protest against basic service delivery, or for basic service delivery. They're using the figurehead of the province, the Premier, and his association with the infamous Gupta family. I'm sure people are aware of that family name and his close association with them, and him being the face of corruption in the province, maladministration. His administration has been dogged by allegations that money is being used privately, that the financials of that province are suffering as a result of that. And ultimately, it's the people on the ground that are suffering because that money is being diverted to projects that is ultimately benefiting middlemen instead of the people on the ground. This despite the Premier making a very bold claim that 70% of his budget is spent on the poor in informal settlements and on surrounding areas around the provincial capital in Mahikeng. I can tell you, having been there for the last week, the state of affairs in these outlying areas is atrocious. So where exactly that money is being spent is the big question.
Yeah, now service delivery protests in South Africa, not a new thing. Is the difference that they've actually put a face to it and they've decided to target the figurehead, as you say, the Premier, Supra Mahumapelo, the fact that they've actually got a name and a face to it this time as compared to the past?
Yes, I think this is all spurred on by the fact that on Tuesday last week, the Red Berets, the economic freedom fighters in South Africa, in that province, they wanted to go ahead with a motion of no confidence in the Premier based on these allegations of corruption against him. They wanted that ballot to be held via secret ballot. So they wanted members of the ANC to be protected if they decided to vote with the economic freedom fighters to oust the Premier in that province. The court said that they want parties, political parties, to go to court to continue arguing, and that's only going to happen in about 3 weeks to 4 weeks from now. And off the back of that announcement that there's not going to be this motion of no confidence, that on the Wednesday morning when we woke up, that is when we could see the black tire smoke, and buses had been burnt, minibus taxis, and shops had been looted. And I think it was just really, it was timing, the fact that the Premier, who has found himself in the headlines for months now, based on his association with the Gupta family, who received business in that province, that received millions in prepayments to their companies, that he was, if not a scapegoat, he certainly was a genuine target for these protesters to be able to voice their frustration.
Honeymoon over for President Cyril Ramaphosa, had to cut short his trip in the UK, come back. Can we say that this is the first major test of his presidency?
I certainly think so. I think it's an indication of just how seriously his presidency and the government at large is taking the situation in the Northwest and is taking these allegations of corruption. Cyril Ramaphosa is a tactician. He is, by and large, a tactician. And the way in which the situation is going to unfold is almost classic Ramaphosa. He is not going to be the one that makes the decision that axes the Premier in that province. He's also the ANC chairperson in the Northwest. So not only is he a party leader, but he's the Premier. He's got a position in government. So the only way to remove him would be for the President to announce that he would like the NEC to direct that ANC caucus in the Northwest to bring their own motion of no confidence against him, to vote him out in that way. But the question is, this close to the 2019 general elections in South Africa, where the fortunes of the ANC have been declining since for the last couple of years, I think publicly to axe a Premier now, this is a decision that Cyril Ramaphosa, the President of South Africa, really has to weigh up. Does he publicly want to go against the administration and axe a man that is seen to have been in the camp of his competitor at the ANC's elective conference, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma? The Premier was seen to be a staunch supporter of her. So there is two factions within the ANC, those that supported Cyril Ramaphosa during that elective conference, and those that those that supported the NDZ. And he is claiming that all the allegations against him are purely politics playing out here, and that they are accusing some foreign third force of trying to intervene to bring about some sort of regime change.
Right, and we heard that a lot from supporters of the Guptas, supporters of Zuma. They use that sort of language. Let me then ask you, Michael, what's the likelihood of Supra resigning anytime soon, whether the President privately or publicly twists his arm in the process?
He's defiant. He's not going anywhere. He's been in that post for the last 4 years, and he's made it very clear. He often gives public addresses. He hasn't done so lately, but he's made it clear that it's his stance on RET, radical economic transformation. He says that there are some in South Africa that are opposed to radical economic transformation that benefits the majority of South Africans. He is using this similar to what the former president, Jacob Zuma, has done when he is in court on those 16 corruption charges, 783 counts of fraud, corruption, racketeering against him. And he is saying that he also is being targeted for his stance on radical economic transformation. Is Premier Supra Mahumapelo going anywhere? I don't think so.
Okay, Michael Apple, thanks for giving us some deeper insight into the situation there in Mahikeng. Thanks for joining us from Joburg. Michael Apple there. That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, we debate why running for political office in Mexico has cost dozens of politicians their lives. Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.